Hello, and welcome back to the Video Essay Podcast. I'm your host, Will DeGravio. On today's show, Kevin B. Lee and Johannes Binotto, the co-leads with Evelyn Kreutzer of the SNSF project, the video essay Memories, Ecologies, Bodies, are back. Today's episode features a live conversation between Kevin and Johannes at the Ausstellungsraum Klingenthal in Basel. They discuss the extended play, a collaboration between artists Anita Mueller and Jennifer Mirlin Schurler. The installation work consists of 4 videos or tracks that function like a musical EP. Collectively, they explore how moving images influence the way humans inhabit their bodies. In this conversation, Kevin and Johannes share their reflections on the themes of work in a joint conversation. They talk about their own relationship to different modes of media experience, from movies to social media, and the effects of these experiences on their own sense of embodiment. It's a fantastic conversation that I'm so grateful to be able to share with you all here. As always, you can learn more about the Video Essay Podcast at thevideoessay.com. Subscribe to the newsletter Notes on Videographic Criticism at thevideoessay.substack.com, and subscribe to us on YouTube at The Video Essay. And now, without further ado, here's the conversation between Kevin and Johannes.
And I are co-leading with Evelyn Kreutzer, video essay, Memories, Ecologies, Bodies. So, you heard the term video essay mentioned several times in the intro, and I don't know how familiar you are with this term, but it's interesting to relate it to these works, or this work that is contained of works, which, it's interesting to think about this work. Wouldn't it be iconic as a video essay in the video artistic gallery or artistic context? That's actually the focus of my research in the project, the ecologies part. I'm interested in how this term video essay can be found in different media spaces, from film festivals and art galleries to social media, the internet, YouTube, Instagram, and academic research as well, because both Johannes and I are academic researchers as well as artists. And so we think about how the audiovisual can be used to advance theory and academic thinking. And it's nice to see all of these elements represented in the work. You're doing it all. You're checking all the boxes. Congratulations.
It's also good for us because always when you when you write these projects, you claim that you say we think those are really like the central topics. So I think we're always relieved to to see the proof that we were actually right, that it really is sort of like very present and crucial. These aspects of like ecologies of memory work and of bodies.
Yeah, and it's really impressive to see you incorporating all of this in a single work. It's a lot to take in. My own practice of video essays, I try to find a distance from the image so that I have time to kind of contemplate and reflect. And what I find so intense about these videos is that they're really multitasking. They're like inhabiting the media form, they're reproducing the media form and critiquing it at the same time. It's like, I want all of that, Why do I have to choose? Why do I have to distance myself? But maybe this relates back to your formulation of, well, what is distance exactly? Do you need to actually separate yourself physically from the object in order to analyze it, to study it, to contemplate it? I think in your work, I do feel a very strong distance from how you regard media objects in your work, but at the same time, there's a strong sense of embodiment and reconnecting. So maybe it's not a binary formulation.
What interests me is sort of like, okay, how do then things change and how do we change? And I think that's, again, I can imagine also for just like making also and this work was, of course, like a really interesting journey, because maybe you have a concept, you have a plan, you want to do this. But when you actually do it, when you actually make these videos, really things do happen. It's when we look at this one, the main character. When you, for example, when you start to play a love scene, there is also something happening in actuality, and that is kind of just like for my own work is the thing that I'm more and more interested, that I feel like movies literally make me feel in a different way, and that's something kind of like I would like to explore. I become different by watching things, and the things that I watch also become different because because watching, consuming that is like an embodied practice. So in a way, kind of like my role model is my younger son, who often picks movies that he is already very familiar with. And he tells me, look, I want to see this film, not because I like the story, because I find the story so interesting, but I really like the way this film makes me feel. And I think this is so true. But it's of course very complex. The film makes me feel myself in a different way, and I think it also changes me. And vice versa. I also like change the media object. So that is very much kind of like the thing that I find fascinating.
Yeah, but okay, this change you in relation to the media object and really distinguishing the distance between the two. I want to get back to this issue of distance because it also informs like how you and I have practiced video essays very differently than what we're seeing here. And the two words that come to mind are found and footage. So, when I was making video essays back in the day, I didn't think about filming myself re-performing these movies. I just like, okay, that didn't feel legitimate to me. It felt more legitimate to actually take the film material and re-edit it in such a way that I could articulate my insight, my way of seeing it. And, this was only possible in around the 2000s when you had, technologies for ripping DVDs and creating, you remember DVDs, right? And creating digital files with them and then uploading them into digital software that consumers finally had access to in the 2000s, and then exporting your video essay and uploading it to this brand new website called YouTube. So that was really a revolutionary moment. And some of us really fought for the right to do this as a form of legitimate critique and expression against, the Hollywood studios and the companies that had the copyright over this material. Like, we have a stake in this media. We want to speak through it. We don't want to just be passive consumers. And so, that was a very important point, and it's really how I practice most of my video essaying. And now what we're seeing is, a work, and actually a lot of video essays are like this now, that doesn't use the existing material and is almost proposing like it doesn't even matter or may not even make sense to have this found footage practice when we are so immersed and so like saturated in media that we ourselves are media. And so we're kind of analyzing ourselves. We're like remixing ourselves as media objects. I think that's one of the propositions that this work is putting forward to us. So I have to think about the difference between the found footage practice that, not just we, but like some of our heroes for, generations before, people like Mark Rappaport or Martin Arnold, many others. I think you mentioned Pierre Hugo, Douglas Copeland. Is it Douglas Copeland or no? Douglas Gordon, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Who did 24 Hour Psycho. Okay. Gordon something. Yeah, he's famous. There's a whole legacy and a whole tradition to that. And, what does it mean for that to give way to this practice, which Well, on the one hand, it brilliantly sidesteps any sort of copyright concerns. So maybe it's also a reflection of Swiss or European, creative practices in relation to, because there's definitely more phobia of copyright violation here than there is in the United States. But yeah,
I mean, it's like that we have like a muscle memory also for the things that we've seen, and this is also something we talked about it kind of like before in regards to these 4 tracks. That it's of course also an interesting question: to what extent is maybe like track number 1, the portal? To what extent is that muscle memory of how it feels to have been immersed in a movie, and then you walk out onto the street, and the movie sort of like still continues? To what extent is that muscle memory still, does still exist in today's audience? And I would claim, well, there is perhaps like, there's part of an audience who, for whom the unseen found footage or the unseen experience that track number 1 is referring to, they cannot kind of like, they don't have that in their mind.
They don't live it anymore.
So that is, of course, so I sometimes like have a feeling of like that this also goes in waves, that it was like, and I also very much like, I still remember that feeling of like having like film history available ready at hand, how that felt, kind of like to have them on VHS tapes. That's very much kind of like something how we grew up, and then kind of like with DVDs. And then when the moment came, oh, we can actually rip that, we can actually make it our own footage.
Right.
How exciting that was. And now it almost feels like that this in itself no longer holds necessarily an excitement anymore, because it's just like, of course the files are available. Although, again, I think things can change very quickly. Again, kind of like with the no longer using physical media, with streaming, and the streaming platforms are also like constantly thinking out new things to make it impossible for you to capture stuff, or maybe even give you like the feeling you don't even need that in your own archive.
You don't own it. Yeah,
exactly. You shouldn't own that. You should just please watch it as often as you want to, but kind of like you shouldn't own it. So, and then I come in here and I see, well, there's a similar attitude in this kind of like, I don't even need the fantasy movie original footage anymore. We just make this. We just make our own footage. So it's interesting, but it's still kind of like the original footage. Sort of like it's somewhere in the background, but even more far away, I feel, in these works than kind of like, it's not even a description of a specific film anymore, but it's much more like a blurred, like like a blurred image of like film history in the background.
That's super interesting, because listening to you, it makes me consider that like even before YouTube, I was making video essays as a kid in the playground, just like reenacting scenes from movies I watched. Like that was a form of remix, embodied remix without the actual material. And I related again to the first track, The Portal, which I think beautifully articulates this experience of carrying a movie with you after you leave the cinema. And it also made me sad watching it, because I actually could not remember the last movie that made me feel like that I left the cinema and the movie stayed like carried into my everyday life, that I was like kind of replaying it or projecting it onto my surroundings. I did that a lot as a child, and even in my 20s. But there's something about, maybe it's just the lack of frequency or just my age, like that just doesn't happen as much anymore. But I do think it's also a generational thing. I think that when I talk to my students about how many times they go to the cinema, it's like once a month, and I ask them, why don't you go to the cinema? And it's just, they don't have the time. It's like, well, you have time to watch 20 hours of a Netflix series, but it's just the way that time is organized and time is presented as like, oh, you gotta carve out 2 hours of your day to go to this place that's not nearby to you, sit down and just concentrate. And that actually sounds like work, and but what you get out of that, because I personally think you need that in order to have this experience of absorbing and internalizing something so much that you can carry it with you. I mean, but maybe I'm wrong, because this work is showing a lot of examples of how media is being carried in microdoses, I guess, like, selfies, YouTube videos, TikToks. It's all content that's like swirling inside of you, and it's finding its way.
And I also remember that kind of like that feeling that like movies came closest to like a feeling as a child of being like totally engulfed in an experience. And I agree that perhaps like this is no longer necessarily that maybe film is not necessarily the object, the medium of choice to experience that. But I still very strongly feel that we have that we like to do that. And again, I think I connected also to these works, and something that I also personally connect very strongly with it, that I realize I become more fascinated with actually making a film than necessarily watching one. Precisely because and not even so that at the end I have a film, but just like the practice is great. It's just like, yeah, let's do this. We want to see how this works. Yeah, let's have these costumes. Let's go to a studio with a black background, and kind of like really try to experience that process. So, and that in a way to me sounds like very much like the same, like what we did on the playground, where we're not satisfied with just watching the movie, but we wanted to be the movie and to make the movie again.
Yeah.
And I see something very similar with kind of like when people are perhaps like watching a music video and they're not satisfied with that, but they want to make their own music video. And I don't think can be that it's just because for about kind of like to get, I don't know, the satisfaction of recognition and clicks and all that. But I think ultimately, no, it's very similar to what we had on the playground, just like it was fun doing it. It's not even necessarily so, you're not even so interested perhaps like to watch it afterwards, but you want to do it, the practice.
It's also interesting to think about how this is all a way of seeing yourself, not just seeing the movie, but seeing yourself. And another kind of way of organizing these videos that occurs to me is that the first one feels like the most quote unquote universal experience of like, oh, anybody can go to a movie, have an intense experience, go out and just feel like that movie's playing inside your head. It doesn't matter who you are. Here it gets a little more specific with this narrative of a love pairing, but I really like that you make ambiguous the gender dynamic, like you say the main character. We don't know if it's a hero or a heroine or neither. And then in the third one, it gets even more specific to female presenting content creators and what it means to perform this like vulnerable femininity and its relation to feminism. And then you have more the trans experience, which, well, I guess by today's standards would be considered the most marginal, but it might actually be the way of the future. So, and it's interesting to think like, okay, maybe in the future, video number 4 will be the most mainstream, and video number 1 will be this like marginal memory of something that no longer happens. And that's kind of scary. I mean, it's scary to think that we're losing that experience, but also exciting that other possibilities of existence are emerging, and what they can afford.
And that you have weird, we were joking about that in the main character, it feels like the appearance of the Discman is always kind of like the Discman is always almost like more nostalgic than the sword. It seems like it's older than the sword, and it's very likely that kind of like a certain audience would not recognize that, whereas they would still recognize a sword. And I find this kind of really funny. It's sort of like the changing temporalities. By the way, also actually fun. You call it a Walkman, and in a way, it is. I think it is correct. It was also like marketed as a Walkman, but for me, it is of course kind of really funny because it feels like, that's what the kids think was a Walkman. But I know what the Walkman was. But I also understand why it is perhaps not present in the movie, because the old Walkman, that's kind of like an even more rare and like super expensive gadget than kind of like some crazy sword. And I find this also fun, how these temporalities, they do not even work chronologically anymore, but sort of like things can all of a sudden, like an old practice can become sort of like a new standard. This the direct address that we connect with a certain style of like television documentary maybe kind of like was not adopted in early video essays and is now coming back. And so kind of like things are disappearing and reappearing in interesting ways.
Yeah. Well, do I go that road or do I share my feelings about Discman? Because I honestly was irritated to see this Discman. It's like, what? Why is this here? And then, and then I was like, listening to you now, I was reminded that I owned a Discman in the 90s as a student, and it cost like $200, and I once flew from college back to my home, and I left it on the plane, and I cried for a whole day because I lost this Discman. And I go from like, what is this Discman doing here? Like not even taking it seriously as an image, because it just seems like kind of this weird, awkward gesture of nostalgia. But now thinking about how much I actually valued it at that time.
Yeah, and I mean, and Hosokawa's The Walkman Effect is like one of the texts that you were referencing, and it's actually what I so love about this text. And this was a text that kind of written really kind of like when just like the Walkman was actually like cassette, not Discman, was introduced, and was making a very beautiful argument already, sort of like totally against this trend that we still have today of kind of like, the new media, they're just like distracting people. They're kind of like, they're turning everyone into their own bubble. They do not really connect with the world anymore. And he made the contrary argument and said kind of like, no, the Walkman is actually a connecting device. It connects you kind of like in a Deleuzian sense with like planes of immanence. It is kind of, it goes even beyond this idea of like, that the kind of like arguing, it's a weird thing. Of course, you're listening to your own music, but at the same time, you are connecting to your environment in a new way. And I remember that, of course, that is also very similar to like, that came closest, I remember as a child, to experience the everyday world like a movie was when listening to music and your environment. And also as a child, I felt, yes, it's true. I mean, to some extent, I am in a dream world, and I'm kind of like away from the rest of us. Also, kind of like, I think we all had this experience, kind of like when we had problems with our families, how important listening to music was, kind of to shield and that off. Yet at the same time, I always felt, but I'm also like hyper connected to myself, to experience, to the world.
Yeah. Now that you mentioned it, its placement does make sense in track 2 because it is about the mobility of media. Like it carries over from seeing the movie and carrying it in your head to like, oh, now you can actually carry the media with you, which then leads to, Instagram, selfie type, form of mobile media production. So yeah, I want to offer a little bit of potential like prehistory of the fourth video, which, you know, on the one hand is like referencing these, you know, YouTube channels that people make, but its particular aesthetics actually remind me of when I lived in New York in the late 90s and 2000s, and there was this like public access TV channel, which had, I think the first time trans television hosts like hosting their own TV channels. And the reason this was possible was that in the 1990s, cable, that was the rise of cable networks, and they wanted to have more and more cable TV channels. And in order to do this, they needed to deregulate television broadcasting, because it was mainly like 3 or 4 main networks. And so to deregulate and open it up to privatization, the government made a deal with these cable companies that, okay, you can play whatever you want, but you need to have at least one channel that has access for the public. So that was the rise of public access channels. And if you remember Wayne's World, there's the movie, but if you've seen the original Saturday Night Live skits that it's based on, it's actually a satire of the type of TV programs that you would see on these public access channels. It's like teenagers or retired people or just random people just, you know, who had a video camera just filming themselves in their living room or in their basement. And it was very like lo-fi. But that's also what allowed a greater diversity of people to present themselves on television. So it's weird to be reminded of like this phenomenon that was made possible by privatization, that privatization actually allowed for diversity on the one hand. And how does that relate to, you know, what YouTube, TikTok, Instagram is allowing? On the one hand, it's like they're owned by these mega corporations who are massively capitalizing on our data, you know, with or without our consent. And at the same time, I would give them some amount of credit in terms of offering a platform for a more diverse, you know, field of human beings to make themselves visible. But there might be a wrinkle in that, because it's like, okay, you may be able to make yourself visible, but are you really visible? And we talked about this earlier.
Yeah, but then again, I think I find it helpful, again, to refocus on questions of when then you say kind of, well, but the amount of clicks is not really kind of like, that's not the marker of visibility for me, but I just enjoy the practice. I want to do this for myself, or what I always kind of like, I prefer, what I think is helpful if we start to talk about resonance instead of success. So resonance, kind of like the feeling that something comes back, that the thing that I did reaches someone. So when you are nodding now, when I say something, that is resonance. And that is more important than having like being successfully audible to an audience of 500 people. So my example is always kind of like literally every single, even the cheapest cat video on YouTube has more success than the most successful video essay I could ever make. But I would argue, I don't think that the maker of the cat video gets sort of like invitations. Hey, we really like your cat video. Please continue to do that. Could you come to Basel, have a talk in an exhibition? We're gonna have dinner afterwards. That's not gonna happen. There's no resonance. And so I think that is also something that I see, that the joyfulness that I see also in these 4 tracks, I think very much like comes from, we enjoyed making that.
Now I actually remember the last movie that I carried with me when I left the theater. Taylor Swift, Harris Tour.
Yes. The perfect paradox to end with.
Thank you so much. I've been